in the Middle Ages, there's often not enough, and it's often weird. It's often written for reasons that are not about documenting the current events for future memory. And when they are trying to document current events for future memory, they're doing it really on purpose in ways that make them least reliable.
Welcome to the Skiffy and Fanty Show.
Hey Sean, do you know why the Dark Ages were called that? Because Bernard of Septimania wore sunglasses.
Weird. Okay, I'm Sean.
I'm Paul.
I'm David.
And we are joined today by David M. Perry. David was a professor of medieval history at Dominican University. He is now at the University of Minnesota in the state that I used to live in, busily convincing students that studying history is good for them and good for their careers, which is actually true. His scholarly work focuses on Venice, the Crusades, and the Mediterranean world. He is the author of Sacred Plunder of Venice and the Aftermath of the Fourth Crusade from Penn State University Press. He's also the co-author with Matthew Gabriel of The Bright Ages, A New History of Medieval Europe, and the book we'll be talking about today, Oathbreakers, The War of Brothers That Shattered an Empire and Made Medieval Europe, published in 2024 by the fine folks at HarperCollins. So welcome to the show, David.
Thank you. That was a great intro. I've never heard the Bernard of Septimania version of that. I'm really happy. It's already a success. I think we should call it. That's a high point. Good night, everyone. That was great.
Well, it won't be the high point just yet because I have so many questions. I have questions.
I'm excited.
This is going to be fun. So one last little bit of business, Paul. Do you want to say the last bit of business before we get down to brass tacks?
Oh, right. I should be looking at the script.
Yeah, that's usually what you do as my co-host.
Yes. Before we get into our discussion with you, David, a reminder to our listeners, please share your questions and comments with us about our show at our various social medias or at skiffyandfanty.com/listener suggestions. If you aren't already, join us on Twitch for Sean's Alphabet streams every Friday at 7 p.m. Central. So if you're listening to this live, you're doing that now to be part of our interactive live streaming format. Finally, you can join our Patreon and be part of our special Patreon-only events on Discord, like next Monday, we're going to all be watching together a terrible movie called The Flintstones. So if that sounds like fun to you to see us be tortured by that live, you can join our Patreon.
All right, so David, if you can, would you tell us a little bit about Oathbreakers? What the heck is this book?
Yeah, so I'm really happy to be here, and I'm really happy to talk to this audience, which is in some ways me, right? I come into the world of doing serious history from the world of reading both nonfiction, but a lot of fiction as well, as a teenager, and then continuing into grad school, and then stopping reading anything fun while I was in grad school because I was tired, but then rediscovering the joy of reading for fun as, postgraduate. And so I'm really, really excited about it. Oathbreakers is a historical story, right? It's a story about the grandsons of the Emperor Charlemagne. And most people, I think, Charlemagne's probably a top 5 person that you've heard of from the Middle Ages, and maybe top 3 of people who are actually real, because King Arthur wasn't. But Charlemagne was. He was crowned emperor in 800, had a big empire, and people sort of know who Charlemagne is. And then they generally, unless they've taken a medieval history class and remembered it, they know that he had this empire and then it didn't last, and then sort of they move on from there. There is a story to the crumbling of his empire, and that story is really about the civil war, a brutal civil war fought by his 3 surviving grandsons. There are lots of Carolingians, there are lots of offspring, some are bastards, some are legitimate, but by the time we get to the 840s, we have 3 surviving grandsons. The eldest, Lothar, who was the new emperor after his dad, Louis the Pious, Charlemagne's surviving son. The middle child, Louis the German, and the youngest, Charles the Bald. And we always use their full nicknames because there are a lot of guys named Louis and Charles in this book. There's a lot of guys named Louis and Charles and Pepin, so we use their nicknames. So Charles was not bald when he was born. Well, he may have been born, probably not when he was a kid, but that's how we remember him. So Louis, Charles, and Lothar fight a civil war. and that's how it falls apart. So that's the story. But what it's also about is just how fast you can have a society that thinks it's telling a story about itself as something important, as something stable, as something permanent, as something chosen with divine and glorious purpose. Literally the new Israelites chosen by the gods, and that they're building something that's going to last, and then it can fall apart really quickly. Almost in some ways, it seems to them almost overnight. As historians, we can say it was not overnight. Here are the ways it plays out. But we wanted to talk about the collapse of a society. Yes, there are perhaps some analogies to today, but that's not, that's always on your mind when you're writing history. You're thinking about today, but we just think it's this big, important historical moment that shifts the course of medieval history in really indelible ways, and it's people making choices, and it's people telling themselves a story that isn't true. It is, as we say in the beginning, an empire built on lies, and all empires are built on lies. And sometimes the lies come home to you, and then things can fall apart. And so that was really, we really want to talk both about the actual, these brothers went here and this brother went there, and they had an army and they did these things, and hopefully tell a really good political military history story, but always keep these big stories of ideas in conversation with it, and hopefully make that really interesting for the reader too.
Well, that leads me to really the first question I kind of wanted to ask, which is basically a craft question, because this is a book that is geared towards a more general audience, and it is not an academic audience as its primary audience, although academics like myself are reading it. And so when you write a book like that for a more general audience, you take a different approach than you would expect in a typical academic book. And I like how in your description you describe this as like telling a story, because effectively that's what the book signals to us repeatedly. Like, we're telling you this story of these things, trying to put the pieces together. And so I was wondering, when you sit down to approach writing this, pulling all the research together and making that story, how does that process look like for you?
I really think that in all writing, you have to really think about who your readers are. You have to think about where they are, think about what it would look like to move them from where they are to maybe where you'd like them to be. And you have to engage them with respect. You have to respect your readers for who they are and what they know. And I write a lot of public facing journalism. Today, I just had a piece about a major piece of disability law. I had to assume the reader doesn't know that, but might be interested, and write a really careful 4 sentence summary of really complicated, important history. Every time you go into a classroom, every one of us who teaches thinks about this all the time. You go into a classroom, you have an audience that at best is semi-interested and semi-informed. And again, I say that with love, not like these students these days don't know anything. That's their job as students, is to be at best semi-interested and semi-informed, and hopefully leave more interested and more informed. That's what you're there for, right? And so you have to, if you go into a freshman history survey and you try to treat them like people who've been thinking about the Middle Ages for a decade, you're going to do a bad job. And I do know faculty who, I think, not any of my friends or colleagues, but certainly when I was a student, there were people who were much more aware of where I was and where we were as students than where they wanted to be. And there are people who just sort of talk to us about whatever they wanted to say without really thinking about audience. And good teaching really requires thinking about audience, and going to them, going to where they are, and then hopefully moving them. That is how we write these books as well, is we really think, what is the story we want to tell? And it's not like the final draft is the same as the first draft. That I think the story we want to tell here is the product of endless revisions and discussions, and tearing things up and sitting down. Matt and I, my co-author, we get together every so often. Our first book we wrote during COVID, so we didn't get together at all, which was not our plan. But this one was not during COVID. And so, we would go to each other's houses, and we would drink bourbon, and we would go fishing, and we would talk about what is the story we want to tell. And every time we ran into obstacles in writing, which is, at least weekly, the answer was always, what is the story we're telling here, and then how do we do that a little bit better? And of course, we have an editor as well who is very engaged in that. But I really think it starts with, who is your audience? Where are they in terms of what they might know? And then go there and try to bring them along with you. And to do it with love. I think it's, with respect and love, not superiority. That's my I think is the biggest failing that academics often have, particularly when they try to write for the public, is they feel like they're talking down, and I don't.
Well, I like that you when you were describing the book, that this is kind of a great example of what you're talking about. You sort of immediately acknowledge probably we all have heard of Charlemagne. And, it's a pretty good chance that pretty much everyone here has heard of that. Paul met Charlemagne once. He doesn't like to talk about it very much, but it may be that you don't know terribly much about kind of what came after, maybe the details of the kids, etc. And so in some ways, sort of beginning as this book kind of does by saying, hey, that Charlemagne guy, kind of a big deal, right? And there was this big empire and all, he was emperor and he was a really big important figure. Well, why isn't that still around anymore? That is part of the question we're now answering, which is, it turns out it wasn't as simple as like, well, Charlemagne died and that was the end. It was, no, there's all of these moving pieces. And I love how much time you spend in this book sort of reminding us and having to take like a temporary detour to like, okay, so remember that thing we mentioned, right? Where this guy was doing this thing or this son was doing this thing. Well, this is when that came up again. And it's, some subterfuge that happened or something in this poem that you mentioned at the beginning that came up. And it made me really trying to imagine like outlining this book must have been very difficult, because there are so many pieces that it's not as simple as just like a handful of names. It's, I think in one of the chapters, you literally go over every single person Charlemagne married and all of the kids that he had. And even the ones that apparently like exist and we may not even know who they are. Like
it's like an epic fantasy cast,
right?
What
we try to do like an epic fantasy cast, right? Is there's a moment we have to tell you the size of Charlemagne's family. We can say, hey, this is not a book where we're just going to list a lot of names, but this paragraph we're going to list a lot of names. So stay with us. We're going to tell you why we're doing it. We're going to tell you why it's important. Then we're going to do it. Then we're going to say, hey, see, we did it, and this is why it was important, and hopefully do it in a way that isn't redundant, but that again sort of keeps people moving along. The great thing, outlining was tricky, but so I was once talking to the local fantasy author Stephen Bruce, right, and I read his books as a teenager, which I like to say to him so he feels nice and old. But I read his books as a teenager growing up in Nashville, and I remember some of his books have these, the sort of murder mystery kinds of, the Jerry books, murder mystery kinds of things, and they have, weird things at the beginning that happen that turn out to be really significant at the end, and it's really impressive plotting. And I said to him, he said, well, David, I revised the books. So like I got to the end and figured out what the secret was. And then I went back and put that at the beginning. It's the same thing here, right? We didn't have to outline all those things because we got to the end and we're like, oh, we sure better do that in chapter 3 so people know why that's important in chapter 9. And that's one of the great things about writing, is that you get to, again, from the craft perspective, right, is that you get to write it and then rewrite it and then rewrite it until hopefully you get to where you want to be. Doesn't mean in the middle of edits I'm always super excited about it, but it is, in the end, the ability to go back in and think about how the story unfolds and rewrite early chapters. And we rewrote a lot of them, and we wrote, that in particular this question of how much do we have to tell the reader to get to the bits we're really excited about, and that's, because you could write an infinite number of pages just getting to the grandsons of Charlemagne, but also at the son and grandsons, Louis the Pious, and then his sons. Like, that's what the book's about. So how much do we do, and how do we decide that? And those are tough decisions. Just as with any world building. It's world building, just like in other kinds of writing, trying to think about world building. And in this case, at least, someone might know who Charlemagne is, so that saves us some time. But you got to build the family. We talk about like the people in the bath, right? Like
yeah.
Who are all these people in the room with him? And that's it's fun. It's fun. At least it's fun in hindsight.
The bath bit, by the way, this is just a fun little Easter egg in the show Vikings that just made me realize why Egbert does this in the Vikings show, because he's constantly in this like Roman bath, and he brings in all the other kings in the show to like come hang out and at the bath, and everyone else is really uncomfortable because like, why are you doing this? But then later you learn that he idolizes Charlemagne And so, and so now that little bath scene in there where you're mentioning how important the bath was to the sort of politicking of Charlemagne's empire, I was like, oh, that makes so much more sense now why he's
But of
doing it.
course, Charlemagne likes the baths because he's being told that the Roman emperors like the baths, right? Like that
Mhm.
too is a kind of homage that he's and to what extent is it really Charlemagne, or is it Charlemagne's very well educated, sort of pro Roman biographers who are telling the story because they want to write Charlemagne like he was Tiberius or Augustus. They want to tell that kind of story. And so that's but also, let's just remind people, medieval people really liked to take baths. They loved being clean. It wasn't always possible to be clean. It wasn't always possible to be warm and have warm water, but medieval people loved taking baths. That's turns out immersing your body in warm water, super nice. And medieval people knew that too. That so we still are trying to undermine some of these medieval myths. That was more the effort of the previous book, but medieval people like to take baths.
Baths are nice.
Baths are nice. So I have a kind of a quasi craft, quasi history research question or point I'll bring up. You bring up in the book that, well, first of all, I just want to point out for listeners and watchers that the Dark Ages are dark because of lack of resources, not because of anything else. You go through that in the Bright Ages, and you come across that problem here, and you mention that you sometimes don't get chronicles for entire years, and you have to figure out what actually might have actually happened. Oh, we must have had a civil war because they don't talk about it in very strange ways and just gloss over things, and they would be in the chronicles if they were. And I wanted you to talk about how you piece together, you and Dave, Matt piece together the information to be able to tell the story, given the relatively limited resources we sometimes have, or the very specific and very pointed points of view from the records we do have.
The first thing I want to say is that the Middle Ages are really big, right? And as academics, we specialize in just some of them. And this is what my co-author Matt specialized in. So I work on 13th century Venice. If we write a 13th century Venice book, that will come out of my decades of work. Actually, don't think that's on the radar in the near future, but who knows, right? But Matt is a Carolingian historian. He's particularly a memory of the Carolingian Empire, the ways in which Carolingians and their successors thought about themselves, thought about sacred time. He just had a wonderful book come out about apocalypse and Carolingian thought, like from Oxford University Press, a very different kind of book. And I could not have written this book without Matt. And he's not here, but I want to make that. So part of what happens is that my co-author has spent decades trying to answer that question in lots of different ways. And so he was my guide through it. The other part of the question answer is that one of the joys of being a medievalist is you learn how to read texts for things that they absolutely do not explicitly say. And what I mean is that if you're doing, and I mean, all historians do this to some extent, but if you're doing 20th century history, your problem is often too much information. That you can pull up a newspaper for every day from any town in 1943 if you go to the right library, the right microfilm collection. There's too much. In the Middle Ages, there's often not enough, and it's often weird. It's often written for reasons that are not about documenting the current events for future memory. And when they are trying to document current events for future memory, they're doing it really on purpose in ways that make them least reliable. We open our first chapter with this really great scene of a coup being plotted by the nobles and the eldest son of Charlemagne. They're plotting in a church. The priest is hiding under the altar. They find the priest. They drag him out. They say either swear, and you're a priest, so you should, when you swear, you have to do it, or we'll kill you, because they don't want to kill the priest. The priest swears, but then decides that he's not actually bound by this oath. In some ways, he's the first oath breaker, although we sympathize. He runs off. He tries to go see Charlemagne. No one will let him in because priests banging on the door in the middle of the night don't get let in to see the king. But Charlemagne says, actually, let's let him in. He reveals the plot and the coup. He reveals the coup. The plot is stopped and the empire is saved. And it's a wonderful story, and it's so wonderful and so detailed that we are absolutely sure that is not what happened. That is not a story we can rely on. It's a story we can tell. It's a story we can talk about. But if we had written that chapter and said, this is what happened, well, it's dramatic. If I was doing a movie, I'd do it like that. But Our job as historians to say, this is what the sources say. Isn't that amazing? Now let's talk about why it says it like that and what we can actually do with the information we have. Let's surround it with every other piece of fragmentary information that we and generations of other historians, and we try to be very clear about, that we're a community and standing on the shoulders of others, giants or not, but we are, that this is a communal effort to know things about the past. So that's really the goal, right? Is you take the story, you say, this is what it says. Isn't that great? It's really fun. We try to tell the most fun stories we can, but never to read them naively, never to just say, this is what happens. It's actually one of, going back to that first question about how you write these stories. Sometimes people talk down to the audience or talk past them. Sometimes I feel there's a whole genre of popular history, I'm not going to mention names, but that just present the content of the stories in a dramatic way, the content of the surviving sources in a dramatic way, but you cannot read them naively. You can't simply believe them. On the other hand, though, like Carolingians like to write stuff down. I don't know. Is this a swearing podcast?
You're allowed.
Okay, yeah.
You're allowed.
They like to write stuff down. At the beginning of the Civil War, Charles the Bald, he sees the Civil War unfolding. He's trying to connect with his brother Louis to fight the emperor, their older brother Lothar. And what does he do? He goes to a relative, and who is a very highly educated man. And he says, "Hey, Nidard, I need you to start writing a history of this Civil War." And he says that at the beginning of the Civil War because getting someone to write a history is a thing that Carolingians do. There were probably lots of them. This is the one that survives. But we're actually very lucky that some of this survives because they wanted to tell stories and they left enough information for us to think really hard about why they tell the stories in the way they do, and then to start unpacking that. And it's true, sometimes there are big silences, and it could just be because rats ate the document. There's a fire in a church treasury in the 1230s that destroyed pretty much everything I would have wanted to read for my scholarly work. So all of my scholarly work is around this big hole where there's a fire. Sometimes people don't write because they don't want to. So if there's, for example, annals are the kind of source that their job is to record what happens every year by year, and they just skip the years for coup. Well, it could just be an accident, but it doesn't seem likely that it's an accident. It's because they're trying not to. There's no way for them to tell the story of the coup in a way that works for their purposes, so they just don't. They just don't, and we can know enough to start to fill in those holes.
Yeah, you make this great point in the book that because very early in the book you're mentioning one of the annals or a text that's an annal, and you guys point out in the book that that they've left this information out, and what are we supposed to do with that knowledge? Well, if you're trying to tell the story of your empire as like unassailable and withstanding all threat and constantly expanding, and like Charlemagne is of God and all of these things. Yeah. Well, you can't have coups because that would suggest weakness and so on. And there are a lot of interesting moments throughout this book where you really try to look at where there's a lack of information and try to figure out or really ask questions. What is really going on? An example I was thinking of was when Charlemagne dies and Louis slowly or fastly, maybe depending on which account you're going with, because he goes up to the old palace and is like, aha, now I am emperor, and depending on where you look, right, it is either a very swift and semi-bloodless thing, or it's very bloody and not so swift. And I
think we have a sentence that's something like, Louis very slowly went at great speed to take command of the court by sending someone else to take command of the court, and then he peacefully joined it by having lots of people executed. And all of these we could footnote, right? I mean, that's fun, but it is also tricky. It sure is tricky.
Yeah.
The other thing, though, again, I want to circle right back to that first question. The people who buy these kinds of books, the popular readership, they like that, right? This is not something that only historians, obviously, we're talking about it, right? Like people get it. You can write that complexity in as long as you scaffold it so that people are ready for it, and readers want to read that. Readers are interested in how knowledge about the past gets made. People do actually want to see the sausage gets made, at least when it comes to sort of history. And I think sometimes historians are are shy about that. Like we know there's complexity, but we better simplify it. That is not the answer. The answer is to build a scaffold and then and then flesh it out and let people see how it happens.
But that gets kind of tricky too, because if you are dealing with these moments of gaps where you have two events on either end and the middle bits are fuzzy, there may be an instinct to want to just, I'm going to give you what I think was the answer. And I actually think you and Matthew both avoid that. And I'm guessing that was a deliberate choice to sort of avoid just giving the absolute, like, this is the most likely, and so we're just going to go with that one. That was a deliberate choice.
Well, there's we do both, but hopefully we do them both deliberately. There's this moment in which Louis the Pious, the emperor, the son of Charlemagne, looks like he's really about to hand the reins and sort of name his main successor to be his middle son, Louis the German. And something happens at this assembly where they say something to each other and essentially never get along again. They may speak again remotely. I have to check my notes. I have notes, but like something happened. We just don't know. We can see the assembly happen. We can sort of see, we can ask who benefits from a falling out and what might have happened. I think we have a worm tongue reference we slip in there on purpose. But like, we just don't know. And we can't know, but we can see it. The other thing, though, there's a battle, the Battle of Fontenoy, which is a battle that most people don't know of, but is one of these kind of amazing battles in well, I guess really in all of history. And it's Saturday. I have to look because I always forget the exact date. It's Saturday morning, June 25th, 8:41. It starts at 8 o'clock in the morning. We have a lot of information about it, but we don't have really good sources like you might want for the Battle of Agincourt. You might have, there's some battles in the First Crusade, I know, where you have a lot of pretty authoritative professional, like being paid, but people who know how to write a military account of a battle and say, these units went here and this went there and the terrain looked like this and these people were armed that way and we had this number and that number, and you can't rely on it. But there are ways that medieval people would describe battles that allow historians, you can war game them. You can build a terrain map and put units on the field and things like that. We don't have that here. We just don't. But also it is just the most important moment, and we have lots of pieces of it. So we do say here's the most likely thing, but we do it really explicitly, and hopefully that works. First of all, we shift into present tense. Like, again, thinking about craft, most of this book is in past tense. It is about the history. It is written in the past tense. But there's a moment where I say, with something like, we can imagine the sound of this, the people charging that way, the screams of the horses. We can imagine Lothar going in, and we trying to be very clear, like, this is our imagining. And then we say very explicitly, okay, let me tell you how we built our best guess. And I'm pretty sure we use the phrase best guess because we don't want to claim something that we can't claim. We do want to tell the story. We want it to be exciting. Something exciting happened there. We have a lot of pieces of it. So I'm going to tell you the story, but I'm going to tell you why it's my best guess and try to make that really, really explicit. And again, like, you don't have to lie to readers. They're not going to throw the book away because you don't sound authoritative enough. I think you sound more authoritative when you say, here's how I put this composite best guess together. Here's my hypothesis. It's probably mostly right. I'm sure there's some details that went a different way, but that's okay. I'm telling you my best guess, and I'm being transparent about it. So that was the move. That was the move we thought we'd go to. But there are other things like, there's a moment when all of the empire, not all, but most of the empire mobilizes militarily to come together for this big battle, which they don't have in the end. They camp on either side of the field, and then there's a big betrayal, Oathbreakers, and that's how it ends. Every single person in the Carolingian Empire was probably at least somewhat aware of this mass mobilization. Troops moving, men leaving for battle, food requisitioned, people marching. So, thousands and thousands of soldiers do not march quietly across a country. There's just nothing. There's just nothing. And so we say, this is what it looks like to move armies around. We have lots of information. This is the scale of the armies that we're moving. We can imagine that people had some thoughts about it, but we got nothing. We just have nothing.
It's so weird. Why don't we have? Why write something down, you jerks? Like, there's got to be like a monk somewhere that just like post-it note somewhere.
I mean, this is something from an Ada Palmer panel at Capricorn. It's like
One of my all-time favorite people.
I know she's awesome. We're not going to turn this into the Ada Palmer appreciation panel, listeners. Don't worry. But she was talking about how a lot of the documents just got lost because there was just not enough material and manpower to turn papyrus into parchment and make all those records. So a lot of stuff got winnowed from the end of the Western Roman Empire period, and just it's like there's just so little material. It's like they had to be really choosy about until paper really got picked up, and paper gets to Europe relatively early, but doesn't get used for so long. So this is such limited amounts of basically raw material and manpower to actually record this stuff. So it's easy for stuff to fall out of circulation and die because there's not 50 copies of it anymore. There's only 2, and that one just got eaten by rats. Oops.
That's right. Librarians make choices. Archivists make choices. That if every librarian, they aren't going to talk about it much, but they are throwing books away. They're throwing them in the trash. Not lots of them, not all the time. They try to sell them, but ultimately, every librarian throws some books away. It's emotional, but they do. That's just the job, right? Some of those books are not going to be around in 1,000 years. Probably most of them. Most of what we are producing digitally is unlikely to survive. And if it does survive, are they going to be able to read Blue Sky logs in 800 years? I don't think so. I mean, maybe, but I don't think so. And, many of our books are just printed on materials that are just not going to survive. It's not that we're going to vanish from human history in this era, but we're going to know more about the 18th century than the 21st century because the 18th century, those books are more durable, right? So like these kinds of things happen. People make choices, people winnow, people throw things out, people decide what to write down, people decide what to copy. And those choices have consequences for us. And sometimes we mourn them. Like, again, I think about the inventories of the treasury of San Marco in the 1230s that burned in a fire. I think about those inventories all the time. I may be one of 3 people who thinks about those inventories all the time, but I think about them enough for, a village. I think about them all the time. They're just not they don't exist. No one copied their inventory logs because they were not the kinds of things you copied. But boy, I would like to see them.
Be cool.
This is what time travel is. There is a Harry Turtledove short story. I can't remember where the time travels go back to the first century AD to find some old books and basically steal them, and things go badly in trying to steal these books.
Harold Turtledove, PhD in Byzantine history, right?
Exactly.
Ada Palmer, PhD in Renaissance history, right? These are my. I read lots of people, I read widely, but I do like people who have this deep education and have figured out how to tell fictional stories. It's really, it's something I love, and something I'm trying to do, but I'm getting a little farther with the nonfiction, but who knows? Like everyone else, I write a little fan fiction and submit and get short stories rejected by Uncanny from time to time or whatever, right? Like that's because I'm really interested. These are really interesting problems to think about from a fictional perspective, to try to play out where you're not bound, where I can invent any sources I want. Although when I do, I also invent huge gaps in the record because that's more fun. But I think about these things all the time.
It's that instead of the god of the gaps, it's like the culture of the gaps, as it were.
Yeah.
Just consider what's my brain just went brain freeze. Blah, 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 blah.
Are you thinking back to when you were Emperor Trajan?
No, I'm not thinking.
Sorry, Dave, you may not know this, but my running thing is that Paul is an immortal, and his most famous form was as the Emperor Trajan in the Roman.
No, that's how he knew Charlemagne.
Exactly. No, I got it.
That totally tracks. I'm with you.
A Canticle for Leibowitz.
Oh, I love that.
So like they have a few documents from Leibowitz's life that they preserve, like the sacred shopping list. It's just like this because this is what they have left in circuit diagrams that they draw in medieval style because that's what they had left.
I think I read that book in 8th grade, and certainly had an impact on me, and apparently not that many people are reading it these days, and I hope it. I mean,
Ugh.
there's a lot of books. There are new
There's
books.
there
There are
there
many
there are,
things, but the way that book plays with memory over a long time is really. There's that one. I actually was just thinking about Adrian Tchaikovsky's Children of Time, right, which has an
mhm.
empire, and then it jumps forward like 4,000 years, and he really thinks hard about like what survives over that period and what are the things they know and the things they don't. They know many things like English, which is I think the language, Imperial Sea, he calls it, but he's really thinking about it. And I do think that speculative fiction is a great place because you can just say, great, 4,000 years later, and then if you've thought hard about it, you can really tell some kind of a story. And I think Harry and Ada as well as Chemical for Leibowitz are great places that and Adrian Tchaikovsky too. I mean, it's really I love it when fiction writers think hard about these things and then execute it. It makes me really excited as a fan, as a reader.
When I guess from a historical writing a history, you're kind of doing that process like in reverse, trying to go back and like fill in as best we can or try to make sense of, effectively what pieces of information we have and the holes that we don't have, and trying to make it's almost like an interpretation and making sense of a period of history so we can try to understand how all the pieces that we do have sort of slot in together like historical Legos, I guess.
I mean, history
And
is a story.
it
And
is a
history,
story.
yeah.
And
I
history
mean, yeah.
rather than as like a collection of facts. Like that is the first thing that you should learn, at least in college history and hopefully in high school history. But many people don't learn, and many people or forget. History is a verb. I sometimes say it's an act. It's an act of interpretation. It's something you do. It's not the past. It is not facts about the past. It's something you do. And again, I think the ethical position of the historian at all levels is to be really transparent about it and and hopefully then also to be exciting about it. Hopefully to say history is a verb. This is how we do it. This is how other people do it. Let me tell you a story about how we tell stories. And it seems like there is an audience for that.
Well, I did want to ask that question actually. The sort of you know you're looking back from the time we're in now and trying to make sense of that. Over 1,000 years, way over 1,000 years ago. How do you how, I'm trying to think of how to ask this question. How do you actually make sense of the people, recognizing that they are in many ways like us, but also in many ways not like us, and trying to do that process of not injecting our perspective we have now onto them, but still trying to make sense of them when we can't actually be in their minds?
Yeah, I mean, you do a lot of reading. Is the real is the re like you read a lot. You read everything you can from the time period. You read a lot of smart people and maybe some not as smart people, but people who have also asked that question. You read what they read. You read their writing. You try to really think about it. You spend a lot of time immersing yourself. And this is why it's so important for me to say that Matt spent decades trying to answer that question for these people. I spent decades trying to answer that question for a different set of people that are 400 years later. And so, yeah, the Middle Ages, but if I spent all of my time thinking about, I don't know, Queen Elizabeth, and you said, well, tell me about Teddy Roosevelt or George, or, Queen Elizabeth II, all right? Like 400 years, people, right? You have to find a focus. You have to do a lot of reading. You have to think very hard. You have to ask good questions, but be open-minded to the idea that maybe your questions are wrong and that you'll find a way through the sources. But also that like these sources, they are written by humans. They are fundamentally humans. They have different kind of cultural specificities. They have different ways of talking about things, but they are humans. Their brains are on an evolutionary scale the same as ours. Their capacity for good, evil, emotion, whatever, all the same as ours. And so and that helps me when I'm trying to figure out what goes on. And they make their humanity clear. We close part of the book with this letter that this woman Duoda wrote to her son, and her son is being used as a hostage, which sounds bad. It's actually not that bad until it is, right? Like giving one of your kids to be raised in the court of the king is kind of a normal thing, but also they're a hostage, and if things go bad, they can be hurt. So she writes this letter to her son. It's really a manual, a behavior manual, a guide to good rule, a guide to proper virtue. It's a long, complicated text. But boy, there are some moments in which it's clear like she is heartbroken because her son is going to go away into this dangerous spot and not be home anymore. And You can recognize that, and you should recognize that. You shouldn't say, well, they're medieval, we shouldn't. Like, no, her emotion is there, it's recognizable, we can feel it. That is
Yeah.
part of, and if you try not to, and there are definitely historians, not so much with this source, there are historians who try not to do that. I think that they often make mistakes or miss things. They maybe more miss things that they miss answers to questions they could have asked, but they would have had to go at it a different way.
Yeah, I like that phrasing. They're missing an element of the human that's in this. Yeah, which that's a fair
I
point,
mean,
right? Yeah.
yeah, these are all humans, even when they keep launching coups from Barcelona of all places, which just like blew my mind twice. Like
Twice, yeah.
why Barcelona?
I just want to say that the Phineas and Ferb shout out that was written by Matt. Most of the bad pop cultural puns in both of our books are written by Matt. Normally, we don't confess who writes which sentence, but I'm 100% allowed to blame all the bad puns on my co-author Matt. I find them kind of charming, but I would never write them, and so I'm delighted that he has less shame and does.
Fair.
That is delightful. So speaking of history, toward the end, you talk about how the Battle of Fontenoy has been, especially started beginning at the beginning of the 19th century in the Napoleonic period, was started to be used as a myth by both the French and the Germans.
Yeah.
And so I wanted you to talk about how we take historical narratives and how we use them and reuse them and change our interpretation of those narratives over time.
No, I think there's a real tendency to this day in general for people to look at current events, look at the history of how we got there, and then tell what I would call a teleological story, where the end has to happen so that the whole interpretive mode of how you read the earlier parts is so you get to our end. And that comes out of how people read the Bible, if they're interested in how we get to Revelation, how we get to the end of days, right? So that's sort of that. In the Western tradition, that is the teleological tradition. I don't know, maybe I'm going a little off the rails here, but it's rails I like to go off. People do that with history all the time. We see it all the time. We see this sort of nostalgia. We see this kind of narrative of inevitability. Right now, from many political perspectives, there's a debate about what is the destiny of the United States. Well, what if destiny is not a question we should ask about a nation, right? There is no destiny. There are choices we get to make, and there are things that will happen as a result of those choices. And those choices are constrained by all kinds of things that we can see and things we can't see. That's true of the past too, right? So in the 19th century, we have these burgeoning or already imperial powers. We have new ideas about what it means to be a state, new ideas about what it means to be a people, new ideas about what it means to be a race, new ideas that are bound up in governmental forms, in military powers, in conquering other people, in new science, in new ideas about the human, in linguistics, sort of what is French, what is German, and they're looking for origin stories. They're looking for a narrative to tell so that the history leads to them inevitably. And this Battle of Fontenoy that does result in a division of Charlemagne's empire, in which there is an area that's more independent, leaving towards Central Europe, and there's an area that's more independent in Northwestern Europe, and we can think about them as sort of leading towards France and Germany, but they are not inevitably leading towards France and Germany. The Lothar has this huge territory in the middle, which again, when I encountered Lothar for the first time, the narrative was, well, he had this big empire in the middle, but it was too long. It was divided by the Alps. It was never going to last. Might have lasted. There are reasons it doesn't last. There are things that happen that break up Lotharingia, and we don't tell that story in this book, but it's a good story. There's a good book by Charles West that just came out about that. That involves a divorce and other sort of racy bits. But
Charles West.
West, yeah, I think he's put out sort of a source book with commentary. It's a great story. But like every minute there's like every generational turn, there's a great story in history, and certainly the fall of Lotharingia is one. It's just not inevitable. So using Fontenoy as an origin story, using the division of empire that follows as a, and this is where we get France and Germany, is just not good history. It's easy to see how they do it, though. There is this really interesting moment in the city of Strasbourg where Charles and Louis come together and they swear oaths, and each of them repeat the oaths in French and in German, in the vernacular languages of the different sides of the empire, so that everyone is speaking both languages back and forth. And that is a moment that has been used as a, well, we can see the French and the Germans are dividing. Sure. Or we can see it as, yeah, there's lots of vernacular languages and they all are multilingual and talking to each other all the time, right? It's just as easy to tell a story about, multiculturalism as it is to be the inevitable division of the French and German people and their cultures. Neither of those are the right story to tell because history is contingent and people make choices. But in the 19th century, the French and the Germans, and also like the other thing that's happened in the 19th century, one of my least favorite centuries. I have a list. One of my least favorite centuries because it is where a lot of the original sins of the historical profession are performed, where history develops as discipline in ways that are recognizable to me today as a historian, and it's being developed by people in Western Europe, white men in Western Europe who want to tell a story of inevitability and distinctness in ways that is, one, not good history, and two, they have a body count, and it's not, they're not unimplicated in the wars of the 19th century and the wars of the 20th century, and the depredations of colonialism and imperialism, right? That history is not the only culprit, but it is one of the culprits. Science is another one, so we can have a different conversation about biology. But history, they're historians. They're my forebears in a certain kind of way, and they are telling stories that have a body count, and doing it just around these kinds of things like why Fontenoy matters. It was a little serious, but I'm a little serious about it. I'm really mad at the 19th century. I'm not mad at them as I am at Petrarch, but I'm really mad at the 19th century. So thank you for letting me get that off my chest.
You're welcome.
You're welcome. Can I ask like a kind of silly question?
Please.
After my heavy questions, trying to
Yeah,
decipher
yeah.
slowly, it's something
Well,
lighter.
So anytime you go down one of these, to me, I feel like as a historian, it's like a more serious version of when I go to Wikipedia and then I just start following links and just get lost for a couple of hours. Because that's literally what happens anytime I watch like the Vikings or Last Kingdom is like I have to go look up one of these real people and figure out what's true in this. So I'm curious, in all of the research and the writing for this book, what for you is like the most, like the thing that sticks in your mind, the fact or the moment or a date or a person that just sits in your mind the most, and why?
I mean, I got to say this battle, right? It's a pretty Saturday morning in June in a nice part of France. I think about it a lot. I didn't get to go last summer. I was hoping to go to Europe last summer. I didn't get to, but Matt did and sent me lots of irritating pictures of him being happy in Fontenoy. I mean, not that irritating, but I was jealous. I'm still jealous. But like they know it's going to happen. They're negotiating when they're going to start. They're meeting and sort of trying to peacefully resolve things, which they've done at other moments, but not really. They're jockeying for position. It's 8 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday, and that's when it starts. And then by noon it's done. And one side is being chased off the field and killed as they run away, which is unusual in the Middle Ages and particularly horrible in this moment. Usually when the other side runs away, you say, "Great, we won." That's it. Because particularly if they're all Franks, so they don't like to kill each other particularly, but they do in this case. And then they reckon with it for a long time. So I really think, I mean, I spent a lot of time thinking about that Saturday morning. I mean, I probably spent 3 months thinking about that Saturday morning. It's the fulcrum of our book, right? It's the moment in which the book, or the pivot point in our book. I think fulcrum is the right word. It is the moment in the book in which everything, it is the most dramatic part of the book. There are other dramatic moments, but that is the most dramatic part of the book. It is, we have these, if you just look at our table of contents, it's sort of, here's 30 years, here's 20 years, here's 10 years, here's 15 years, here's Saturday morning, right? And that's on purpose. When we were talking about outlining earlier, like we thought, okay, we're gonna give an entire chapter, and then in some ways the next chapter is, and here's how they thought about that Saturday morning for the next few years afterwards, because it's just that important. So if you spend, and the sources are, as I said earlier, unclear. So I mean, I just spent months thinking about that Saturday morning, and it's a kind of history I've only done a couple of other times in my career, and I don't expect to do that many. I mean, often when there are events like that that you need a narrative of the kind that we produced, other people have already produced that narrative. So like, there's a Palm Sunday in 1204. There's when the Frankish army attacks and takes the city of Constantinople, and I think a lot about that. That's actually that's the early 13th century. That's the stuff I know. But lots of people have written that story, so I'm working with them and the other scholars and how to tell my own version. This one doesn't have that. I mean, there are reasons why academic histories are a little lighter on the narrative of what happens that morning because the sources are bad. So you have to say things like we imagine and we think and we feel and we can, we can see Lothar run away. That works in this kind of history, but does not work in your dissertation. You write that in your dissertation, they don't graduate you, right? You write that in your Oxford University Press, if you even get it to publication, you get mean reviews about it in your book, probably, in the journals, probably. This we can do that. And so I really felt like I had to do a lot of work um, with Matt, obviously, and reading lots and lots of people, but really thinking, how do I tell the story of these 3 hours on a nice Saturday morning in June? So I mean, I mean, it stayed with me. It stayed with me. I'm thinking about it right now. I'm thinking about not just the day, but the process, the thinking that it took to get to there.
Yeah, that trying to imaginate things that we don't have. I assume I'm going to assume listeners haven't, but I assume you've at least heard of Dark Queens by Shelley Pollack.
Yes,
The
absolutely.
Yeah,
I did a
I mean, I
lovely
read
event with
that.
her. Yeah.
Yeah, I read that like early last year, and it kind of fits well in with this book. There's a lot of stuff we don't know about, and it's for listeners who don't know. It's set a couple centuries before this, and basically in how the Merovingians really came to be before we ever get to the Carolingians, and we don't. And she has to say that I imagine this, and I imagine it could be like this, and over because there's just no enough sources to go by. And
Yeah.
so you have
Yeah.
to kind of piece together and figure out things, as we were talking before, from what is said and what isn't said, and the lack of textual sources, and basically kind of. This is not a judgment call because I consider my office. It's like kind of like painting a picture rather than taking a photograph
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
of a place.
talk about a moment in which the sources we do have are amazing and totally unreliable. Like that coup story with the priest and the thing. Those Merovingian sources have some great stories of sex and murder and all the things you would want for your show. And they are just not like
So,
I mean, it could have happened that way. I'm not saying you can rule it out, but boy, I mean, um, there's a lot of stuff going on there. There's a great new book that just came out on the Merovingians too, if people are interested, by James Palmer. That is sort of an introduction to the Merovingian world. One of the fun things about the Merovingians, sort of this pre dynasty, right, is that the big narrative is Franks take over this area and they form this weak kingdom, the Merovingians, that is never really any good. And then the Carolingians come and they form a great empire, but then sadly it falls apart. And it could have had Europe as we want it to be in the ninth century. We could have had Rome restored, and neither of those narratives are true. That the Merovingians are really interesting and complicated, and did a lot of amazing things and a lot of terrible things, and made good and bad decisions, and that's also true of the Carolingians. And that's really, it's sort of how Carolingian propaganda infuses 19th century history making, which then still today shapes how
Yeah.
Western Civ, if that's still the class being taught, which it is in many places, or European History 1 or World History 1. It's still how these things are being taught. I recently went through all 51 states, well, 50 states plus DC, sorry, all 51 school districts that I was interested in, and looked at some of how the Middle Ages are being taught. And they're mostly happening in either seventh or 10th grade, sometimes ninth grade, seventh grade world history, ninth grade world history, depends on the state. And like There's like 8 things, and one of them is Charlemagne built an empire. Oh, it fell. And is that one of the 8 things I want every sixth grader in Kansas learning? I'm not sure it is. They didn't ask me,
Sure.
but I would suggest some other ways of going about it.
I mean, Charlemagne's in the new Civ 7, so it's like,
Yeah.
there he is. He's got a goofy look. He's got a crown. There he is. But yeah,
Yeah, I'm glad you bring up the school thing, because this is a thing that literally just happened to me this week after I saw the Ada Palmer History of the Books talk at Capricorn. And I didn't know that, like, the Library of Alexandria was not the myth that I've been told, right? Where it's
right.
just
We were
like
talking about that
all
earlier,
the
yeah.
knowledge of the world was lost, and it's we lost lots of originals, but we didn't necessarily lose everything from that moment. And, like, one of my students literally brought up, oh, it's like the Library of Alexandria, right? Like all of that stuff. And I was like, aha, I know a thing I can tell you about from a professor of history. And so then that just went down a rabbit hole. This group of students I got, they just love talking about all kinds of wild and bananas stuff. But it was one of those great moments where I was like, aha, I used to believe this too. Now I can tell you that it's
Right.
not true.
Right. Right. I mean, it's great. And as professional historians, that happens to us all the time when it's outside of our small field. I mean, I my first viral moment on Blue Sky back when there was probably like 200,000 users was when I said casually, "Okay, so we all know that there's no such thing as feudalism." And I had a thing I wanted to talk about with the and.
Yeah.
And I was like, wait, including like, historians, but historians of 18th century Japan or, 20th century Western America or whatever, right? Like, they're like, wait a minute, what? There's no such thing as feudalism? I'm like, no, that's not what I want to talk about. I want to talk about this other thing. They're like, wait a minute. Because so I mean, and that's certainly true for me, and with all kinds of different moments, right? You can be a trained historian who spends your life thinking about history and suddenly discover, wait, what? And then,
Yeah.
if you're lucky, you have someone who's an expert who can tell you a good story like Ada. Sometimes you go down the Wikipedia rabbit hole. Sometimes you have to start checking out books or and that's one thing we do have right now. Again, I'm skeptical about it lasting 1,000 years, but we have and I'm we have had such unprecedented access to information in the last 20 years, that has been really amazing. How generative AI is going to break that down and introduce lies into the historical record, I have a lot of thoughts on. I should probably try to write that short story next and then submit it to analog and get that rejected because I like to collect the rejections.
Oh, you should write that for sure, because I've been getting real uncomfortable with how quickly my field in academia has just said, yeah, let's just teach them about AI. Like, let's just do it. And I was like, but why? What's the reason? And so far, the only answer I've seen in the literature I've read is, well, it's there and it's not going away. And I'm like, there are a lot of things that are there and are not going away, but we don't put them in our bodies. So,
If I may, I just today had a piece go up in the Washington Post that's a review of a book called More Than Words, by John Warner, and another book that's about college, but is exactly about that. And I think everyone who teaches English would do well to take a peek at it. I think you will.
okay.
It will provide you with some useful ideas and language that if I were teaching introductory English, I would be very happy to have in my pocket. And I've been handing it out to history people too. So I think it's a book that those of us in this teaching business in the humanities, we need these arguments. We need to be able to talk about these things. And what
Yeah,
John's
I
point
agree.
is in this book, John is really, really a great writer about writing, and I think is relevant kind of to this podcast, right? Writing is thinking. Writing is not about producing words. It is about thinking. It's about the relationship between thoughts and then words. And ChatGPT cannot do that. It can produce the words, and even if the words are exactly the same, which they won't be, but even if they were exactly the same, it is not the same thing because the thoughts are behind it. The kind of the storytelling, the decision making, that we've been talking about this whole hour is
Yeah.
cannot it cannot be done. And he makes the point that like a calculator is actually doing the same thing that our brains are when we do addition or multiplication. That a calculator, in fact, is doing the same thing. It's just doing it in an automated, different kind of way. Whereas ChatGPT, because writing is a different thing, it cannot. It just cannot. It is not the same. And I hope all of us in all of our creative fields and our teaching and in all genres that we just keep saying that. And I'm certainly going to keep saying it.
Yes, a generative AI picture of Yosemite is not a photograph of Yosemite.
Right.
It doesn't know it's making Yosemite. It's a 18, like I can say, 18% gray goo slop approximation of anything.
And even if it looks the same, right? Even if it looks exactly the same, it is not the same thing. It is not the same thing on an ontological, on a core level as
Yes.
you taking the picture with your camera, with your human eyes, your human mind, making decisions. Now, the next question is, does it matter if it looks exactly the same? I think it does. We're going to have that conversation a lot. Before we get to the does it matter, I just want to say it is, even if it is identical, which it won't be, but even if it is identical, it is not the same.
Well, I think the matters question is really big. One of the things I was talking with my students about, because I teach intro comp, and we were talking about like annotations and note taking and so on, and I was trying to point out to them, because some of the research really supports this, that like it's fine if you're going to use a digital method and just like do some highlights and so on, but actually taking that time to take a piece from something and then rewrite it in your own words, you're synthesizing that information. You're actually thinking through how to make sense of that and then write it in a way that shows your understanding. And that is going to improve your comprehension and your understanding of material. And it works the noggin in a very, very powerful way. And having a machine give you the, like, it's like Cliff Notes. Like, Cliff Notes is fine as a like study aid, right? But if that's the only thing you use in order to get the information, you are not processing the information anymore.
Yep.
And that's a problem. The lack of processing, like, we have to process this stuff, because the second you stop doing that, you can't trust anything on like, the internet is a cesspool. We all know this.
Also, like the stuff we do in our brains when we create things is great. It's
Yes.
wonderful. It's great. I mean, it's often really hard. I whine about writing. Why did I decide to become a writer? I could quit being a writer tomorrow. All the things that writers say. Turns out I don't think I can quit. But there have been moments where I've wanted to, because the thing I was right. The edits came in. They were really hard. I did not want to edit chapter not right, like, but like it's also wonderful. I mean, it's one of the greatest gifts of being human, is the ability to do these kinds of things. Even if what we produce, when people ask me a lot about like, blogging and other kinds of public writing, and I say, listen, you might write, or writing fiction or whatever, you might write something that people read, you might write something that makes money, and all that's fine, but the writing itself has to feed you. And I started on this. I was saying, right before we started, that I'm dyslexic. I liked learning. I hated writing because it was hard. It didn't come out. I started learning how to write in my late 30s. I'm 51 now, really my late 30s, writing short form, writing voice to text, and then revising it. I wrote blog posts every day for like 4 years, 5 days a week. I did it on purpose. Yeah, I might miss a day or two, but basically I wrote a blog post every day. Some days, a couple thousand people would read it. Some days, 11 people would read it. But I was doing it because I just wanted to create this practice and this discipline and get words out of me. And I love thinking back to that time. I do different kinds of writing now, but only because I spent those years just doing that thing again and again and again and again to teach my brain new things.
That's awesome. Well, we're running out of time, unfortunately. And
Sadly
so
and
we,
tragically, yes.
sadly and tragically, we do need to start winding down. And so, um, Oathbreakers is out now, so you can get it. But the big question for you, David, is what are you working on next?
Well, I have, it's very blurry there, but it's because it's such a shiny cover. There we go.
There we go.
I have a lot of projects that I am lucky in that my coming up with ideas is not my problem. Select and I don't. There are people who do have trouble coming up with ideas, and they find one in there. But I have lots of ideas. Matt and I are talking about some different books. We wrote The Bright Ages. It was a big book, and normally, actually, people write small books first, and then you write the big book. But we had this big idea, and we wrote it. And then we're like, we talked about other big book ideas, and ultimately, we wanted to do is we wanted to the Bright Ages, they're stories that are human, they're stories that are knowable, they're stories that are connected. So we have a piece of the world that's connected to other parts of the world. And we thought, well, we can tell more stories like that, but in length and detail. So we ended up here. The Carolingian Civil War is a story Matt really wanted to tell, and he sold me on it, and he's right. It's great. I mean, I hope people like Oathbreakers. I think it was a great choice for us to do. There are essentially an unlimited number of moments like that in the history of the European Middle Ages that we also could tell knowable, human, permeable kinds of stories. And some of them have been told by other people, and some of them have not. And so Matt and I are talking about what that might look like going forward. And if all of you listening would buy a copy of Oathbreakers, that will make it much more likely that we'll be able to sell that next idea, because this is, a market. But Matt and I talk about that a lot. Um, I have some other things out there. I have a secret project I can't discuss because there's a proposal and it's in the hand of editors, and it's edgy and it might not sell. It might sell, but it's not a shoe in. But like that is the thing where my heart is at, but I can't talk about it, which is painful. Um, I have a big, epic, tall ships science fiction story I'm writing with my local friend Adam Stempel. It's set a couple thousand years in the future on the Great Lakes. So it plays with lots of the themes that we talk about, but at 100%, it is our premise is, and you have to accept this like the book, we have late 17th century ship technology on the Great Lakes a couple thousand years in the future. And so we have big ships. We think there's not enough big ships in science fiction. We think there's like spaceships as big ships. That's good. Horatio Hornblower in space, we got that. But we don't have like cannons and big ships, but in the far future. And we've set it on the Great Lakes because we're in Minnesota, and also it's fun. Great Lakes are fun if you think about them from the perspective of big ship battles and how that would work. So that's something we're deep in writing. I can talk about. I don't know what's going to happen with it, but that's been lots of fun. Um, the thing though is I'm writing a lot of short form work. This is a complicated political moment. I'm a political writer. I tend not to go on podcasts unless it's a political podcast, and talk about Trump, but I have lots of thoughts and they're not hard to find because I'm a political writer. I'm really trying to write about specific types of policy, education, disability, healthcare, Medicaid in particular, and how they impact real people, how they impact my family. And that's the kind of storytelling I think is useful. And I'm trying to do it as much as possible for the Star Tribune, for local papers to write in my communities. And so I hope that those of you who are in the Twin Cities will read it and will take a look at it. Hope if you're not in the Twin Cities, you will too. But tell the Star Tribune, hey, this was good, and because I'd really, the only thing I really know how to do in moments like this, I can't take crowds. Like I have mental breakdowns in crowds, so I'm not going to protest. I'm not going to run for office. I'm not wealthy. I can't just donate, throw money at the problem. But I seem to be able to tell stories, and so I'm trying to tell ones that are useful. And if other work or fun work, I love our big ship battles. They're really fun to write. But if other work has to go to the side a little bit, then that's okay. But they won't, because writing, the more I write, the more I write. That when I'm in good form, I'm writing more, and when I'm in bad form, I'm writing less. So I don't think I do have to choose. No, it wasn't an easy answer, but like I'm writing, I have like 18 different possible things, and but also I'm a commercial writer. Like who's going to give me a contract, and then I'm going to do that one.
Yeah.
And I'm not in this. I mean, you are not in academia in this context of this podcast. Academics don't like talking about money. I like talking about it to academics. Writing is business. Writing is labor. I'm trying to sell it. There are markets. The markets are unfair. They are filled with bias and bad decisions and gatekeepers and mean people and also wonderful people and opportunities. And I'm trying to work in a market or a lot of markets. And so we'll see. We'll see who says yes, and then that's what I'll be doing.
That's a lot. Well, if
Yeah.
people want to follow to find a lot of this, because as you say, you're writing quite a bit, where would they go to find you and your
Please come to
things?
Blue Sky. Blue Sky is my social media of choice. I have presences in other places. I don't really have a presence in Twitter, though the account just sits there dead because I don't want to. I don't feel like deleting it, but I'm not using it. So don't find me there. But Blue Sky is really where I've been now for a couple of years, and at its best, it's pretty good. So that's the place to go. I do have a Patreon. You can find that off Blue Sky. But that's really where I'd like to see you. Because I'm a freelance writer, so I'm writing in 18 different outlets. I need you to come to me, and then I'll send you to them.
Perfect. Well, David, thank you very much for coming on the show and talking to us today.
I am a big fan of your show. I've
Aw.
really enjoyed my conversations, particularly with Paul over the years on social media. And so this was a conversation I was eager. I was so happy when you invited me. So
We're so
I'm
glad.
really grateful. I'll come anytime you want to talk history or anything else.
We can
Thank you
find
so much.
excuses. We can find excuses. Yeah. Well, I may have to find a way to get you back on to like actually talk your ear off a little bit about every historical TV show drama that I watch.
I'm in. Let's do it.
Okay, cool. Because I have so many opinions. Oh, Vikings, you drive me nuts. I love it right up until it like just. Sorry, I need to save this. I'll save it for another day. Anyway.
With you. I'm
Well,
with you, man. I feel it. I feel it.
you can feel it. Okay, good.
Yeah.
That's the show, folks. So if you'd like to let us know what you thought about this episode, or you have questions, or you want to recommend history books to us, that would also be fun. skiffingfanty@gmail.com is the best place to find that. And then we have a Discord and a Patreon page, and we're on Blue Sky and Threads and Mastodon, all these places. The best place to go to find all those links is skiffingfanty.com/skiffythings. Excuse me, my cold is now finally catching up with my nose, so I sound like I'm where it is at the end. Yeah, you can catch us for the Skiffy Fanny Show every Friday 7 p.m. Central on twitch.tv/alphabet streams. I stream Wednesdays and Sundays at 6 p.m. If you want to find me, I'm at SeanDuke.net and all that good stuff. And then patreon.com/skiffyfanty if you want to support the show, get into our Discord, do weird things if you want. Paul?
And you can find me, Paul, Prince Justin, ubiquitously on the internet, except in the lands of fascists, as Prince Justin, PRINCEJVSTIN.
Yeah. All right, as is required by the 2025 Skiffy and Fanty bylaws that were amended at the beginning of this year, I have to make it happy. And so my happy shift for today is that because we had this episode happen, Paul will be gifted 6 million tulips.
Oh, dear Lord. Where will I keep
And so,
them?
well, that's for you to figure out. You can donate them as you please, but
Well, I'm going to have to photograph them first. Yeah,
you will photograph all 6 million. So expect the pictures on Paul's Blue Sky and Instagram of all of the tulips that will come all at once. It's all coming it's just going to be miles of trucks. So you're welcome, Paul.
Well, as Sean has said, I am the reincarnation of Emperor Trajan, and I've been told to read some Latin here. Tibi istum ad monumentum me comito si recte agam sin aliter in me magus.
What the hell does that mean?
I am the basically my Latin is rusty. Basically, I am the fortress. You can rely on me.
Nice. Well, on that note, happy ending and see.
And see.
If you want to support this show, you can go to patreon.com/skiffyandfanty or skiffyandfanty.com, our website, where you can get access to all of our fancy things. Our music comes from Holy Mole. You can support him and his work at patreon.com/holymole. Thank you for listening.